Tonight, we are going somewhere enormous, not just in geography, but in ambition. At its height, the Spanish Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched across 2 continents, wrapped around the Pacific Ocean, and touched the shores of Asia. It produced cathedrals in the jungles of Mexico, silver mines buried inside Andean mountains, and trading ships that crossed waters no European had charted before. It is a story about gold, yes, but also about hunger, miscalculation, brilliance, and a particular kind of ruthlessness that tends to show up whenever one civilization crashes headlong into another. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you have been here before, I am glad you came back. If you enjoy what I do, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps keep this going. And wherever you are watching from tonight, whether it is late in London, quiet in California, or past midnight somewhere in Southeast Asia, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It helps other sleepless people find their way here too. Now, get comfortable, settle in, let the day go. We are about to drift back to a peninsula on the edge of the known world, where a marriage between 2 young royals quietly set in motion one of the most consequential empires in human history. Before there was a Spanish Empire, there was not even a Spain. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the story of the empire cannot be understood without understanding what came before it. A peninsula divided, contested, and fought over for the better part of 8 centuries. The Iberian Peninsula, that broad thumb of land jutting into the Atlantic at Europe's southwestern corner, had never been a single unified place. In the early 800s, it was a patchwork. In the north, a series of small Christian kingdoms clung to the mountain ranges: Castile, Aragon, Leon, Navarre. In the south, the Moors, Muslim rulers who had crossed from North Africa in 711, held the fertile lowlands and the cultured cities of the south. Córdoba, under Moorish rule, had been one of the largest cities in Europe, a place of libraries and philosophers and running water, when most of the continent was still working out how to keep the roof on. The centuries that followed 711 became a long, grinding, irregular process that historians call the Reconquista, the Reconquest. It was not a clean or continuous military campaign. It was more like a tide, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, interrupted by treaties and alliances, and occasionally by Christian kingdoms fighting each other more enthusiastically than they fought anyone else. The Moors were not a single unified force either. The caliphate fractured into smaller kingdoms called taifas, which fought among themselves and sometimes hired Christian mercenaries to do it more efficiently. One of those mercenaries, a Castilian nobleman named Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, became famous enough on both sides of the conflict that he is still remembered today by a name the Moors gave him: El Cid. By the 1400s, the Reconquista had been grinding forward for 700 years. The Christian kingdoms had pushed steadily south. What remained of Moorish rule was the Kingdom of Granada, tucked into the southeastern corner of the peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by Christian territory. It had survived through a combination of tribute payments, diplomatic maneuvering, and the fact that nobody had quite gathered enough unified force to take it. That changed in 1469. In October of that year, a 17-year-old princess named Isabella of Castile married a young Aragonese prince named Ferdinand, who was 18. It was not a love match arranged at leisure. It was a political operation conducted in something close to secrecy, because Isabella's half-brother, King Henry IV of Castile, had not authorized it and would not have. The two had never met before the ceremony. Ferdinand had actually disguised himself as a servant to cross into Castile without being stopped. They were married in a small ceremony in Valladolid, and the whole affair had a slightly improvised quality that their later reputation tends to obscure. What they built together, though, was not improvised at all. Isabella became Queen of Castile in 1474, After a disputed succession that briefly looked like it might collapse into civil war, Ferdinand became King of Aragon in 1479 after his father's death. The two crowns did not formally merge. Castile and Aragon retained their separate laws, their separate administrations, their separate identities, but they were now governed by the same two people, and those two people had a very clear sense of what they wanted to build. What they wanted, above all else, was unity. And they defined unity in a very specific way: Catholic unity. In 1478, Isabella and Ferdinand established the Spanish Inquisition, a church tribunal with royal backing, initially aimed at Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity who were suspected of secretly practicing their old religions. The Inquisition became one of the most efficient and feared institutions in Europe, not because it executed enormous numbers of people. The popular imagination has inflated those figures considerably, but because it created a culture of religious conformity enforced by surveillance and accusation. The records it left behind are, today, some of the most detailed documents of everyday life in late medieval Spain, which is one of history's more ironic archival jokes. In 1492, the final piece fell. In January of that year, after a 10-year military campaign, the Kingdom of Granada surrendered to Isabella and Ferdinand. The last Moorish Sultan, Muhammad XII, known to the Spanish as Boabdil, handed over the keys to the Alhambra Palace and rode out of the city. The Reconquista was over. The peninsula was, for the first time in nearly 800 years, under a single Christian authority. Pope Alexander VI himself, notably, a Spaniard, gave Isabella and Ferdinand the title Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs. It was a title they used with considerable satisfaction, but 1492 was not finished handing the Catholic monarchs its gifts. Just 3 months after Granada fell, in the same year that Spain was finally unified under Christian rule, Isabella signed an agreement with a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus to fund a westward voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The two events are connected in ways that go deeper than the calendar. The energy and institutional machinery that had been built and refined over 8 centuries of reconquest, the military orders, the frontier culture, the expectation that territorial expansion was both a religious duty and a path to personal advancement, did not simply switch off now that the peninsula was won. It turned outward. The men who would cross the Atlantic in the decades that followed were products of this world. Many of them came from Extremadura, the dry western region of Castile that had produced soldiers and minor nobility for generations, men trained in a frontier culture where land was taken by force, where the church blessed the taking, and where the rewards went to those bold or brutal enough to seize them. They carried all of that across the ocean with them. The Iberian Peninsula had given Spain its shape. Politically unified but regionally fractious, militarily experienced, religiously driven, and hungry genuinely. Practically hungry for resources and status that the exhausted economy of a long-warring kingdom could not easily provide. By the end of 1492, the stage was set. The Catholic monarchs sat in their newly consolidated kingdom, the ink barely dry on their victory at Granada, and somewhere to the southwest, Columbus's small fleet of 3 ships was already moving across open water towards something no one on the European side had mapped. What happened next would take a century and a half to fully unfold, and would leave almost nothing in the Western Hemisphere unchanged. The Crown's gamble. Columbus had been turned down before. This is important to know, because the image that has come down through popular history, the visionary navigator, the flat earth skeptics, the triumphant queen tidies up a far messier and more interesting story. The voyage of 1492 was not a moment of obvious genius finally recognised. It was the end of a long, grinding sales process, conducted by a man who was, by most accounts, enormously difficult to deal with, and who had already been rejected by the one kingdom that would have been the most logical choice to fund him. That kingdom was Portugal. Portugal, in the 1480s, was the undisputed leader of European maritime exploration. Its navigators had been methodically working their way down the African coast for decades. Funded by the Portuguese crown and guided by the institutional knowledge built up at the School of Navigation associated with Prince Henry, known later as Henry the Navigator, who had died in 1460, but whose legacy continued to drive Portuguese ambition southward. By 1488, Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the southern tip of Africa. The Portuguese could see that a sea route to Asia, to the spice markets of India and the silk ports of China was within reach by sailing east and south. Columbus came to the Portuguese court in the early 1480s with a different idea. He wanted to reach Asia by sailing west. His argument rested on a calculation of the Earth's circumference drawn from a combination of ancient geography, selective reading of Marco Polo's accounts of Asia, and a cartographer named Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, who had written a letter suggesting the western route was feasible. The calculation Columbus used was wrong, significantly wrong. He estimated the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan at roughly 2,400 miles. The actual distance is closer to 12,500 miles. Had there been no Americas in the way, Columbus's fleet would have run out of food and water somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Portuguese geographers who reviewed his proposal knew this. They looked at his numbers, compared them to their own, and said no. The Earth, they correctly pointed out, was considerably larger than Columbus believed. The western route was not practical. Columbus then took his proposal to Spain. He arrived at the Spanish court in 1486, carrying his charts and his optimistic arithmetic, and met with Queen Isabella. She was interested enough to convene a commission of scholars and advisers to review his plan. The commission took 4 years. When it finally reported back, the verdict was largely the same as Portugal's. The distances were too great, the calculations unreliable. The commission recommended against funding the voyage. And yet here is where the Spanish story diverges from the Portuguese one. Isabella did not close the door entirely. Columbus remained in Spain, lobbying, waiting, and making himself persistently visible at court. He had a particular talent for finding patrons. Luis de Santangel, a financial official in the Aragonese court, became one of his most effective advocates. When the commission's negative verdict seemed to have finally ended the matter, Santangel reportedly went directly to Isabella and made the case again, this time emphasizing the low cost of the gamble relative to the potential reward. The cost was genuinely low. The entire expedition would be financed partly by the crown, partly by the town of Palos de la Frontera, which owed a debt to the crown and paid it in ships, and partly by private investors. Columbus himself contributed a small sum. The total outlay was modest by the standards of a kingdom that had just finished financing a decade-long military campaign to retake Granada. What Spain stood to gain, at least in theory, was enormous. Not gold, specifically not yet. What the crown wanted was a westward route to Asia, to the same spice markets that Portugal was working to reach from the east. Spices in the late 1500s were not a luxury in the modern sense. They were essential to food preservation, medicine, and trade. The market for pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg was enormous, and the overland routes that had supplied Europe for centuries had become increasingly difficult and expensive since the Ottoman Empire's consolidation of control over much of the Middle East and Anatolia. Whoever controlled a reliable sea route to Asia would control a trade network of incalculable value. In April of 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand signed the agreement known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe. The terms Columbus negotiated were extraordinary. The crown, to its later regret, agreed to grant him the hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the position of Viceroy and Governor-General of any lands he discovered, and 10% of all revenues from those lands in perpetuity. It was the kind of contract a man extracts when he has been made to wait long enough to become stubborn about it. 3 ships were assembled at the port of Palos de la Frontera in the southwestern corner of Spain. The largest was the Santa Maria, a cargo vessel that Columbus used as his flagship. The other two, the Nina and the Pinta, were smaller and faster caravels, the kind of nimble, shallow draft vessels that Portuguese navigators had refined specifically for Atlantic sailing. The crews numbered somewhere around 90 men in total. They were not, as the romantic version sometimes suggests, desperate convicts or the dregs of Spanish society. Most of them were experienced sailors from the port towns of Andalusia, men who knew the Atlantic well enough that the idea of sailing further into it was not entirely terrifying, just reasonably so. On August the 3rd, 1492, the fleet left Palos and headed south toward the Canary Islands, where they stopped to resupply and make repairs before turning west into open ocean. What followed was 33 days of nothing but water. The crossing was not as dramatic as it is sometimes portrayed. The trade winds that blow steadily westward across the Atlantic at that latitude carried the ships at a reasonable pace. There were moments of anxiety among the crew. The magnetic compasses behaved strangely near the Sargasso Sea, and the extraordinary distances covered without sighting land. Unnerved sailors trained to navigate by coastline. Columbus kept 2 logs, one that showed the true distances covered and one that showed smaller figures, which he shared with the crew to keep morale intact. Whether this was strategy or early maritime management theory is difficult to say. On October the 12th, 1492, a lookout on the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana sighted land. The island Columbus came ashore on was somewhere in the Bahamas, which specific island remains contested among historians, though San Salvador is the most commonly accepted candidate. Columbus called it San Salvador, claimed it for the crown of Castile, and recorded in his journal that the people he found there were gentle and would make good servants, and that they could probably be converted to Christianity without much difficulty. He had arrived looking for Asia, and was entirely convinced, for the rest of his life, that Asia is what he had found. Back in Madrid and Lisbon, the news travelled fast and immediately produced anxiety in Portugal. The Portuguese crown protested that any Western discoveries fell within their zone of exploration under earlier papal agreements. In 1494, Spain and Portugal sat down and drew a line across the world, a theoretical vertical line in the Atlantic, established by the Treaty of Tordesillas, with Portugal claiming rights to everything east of it and Spain everything to the west. This arrangement had a comfortable simplicity, interrupted only by the minor detail that neither country had mapped most of what they were dividing. The Crown of Castile had taken its gamble. It had spent a modest amount on 3 ships and a persistent Genoese navigator with bad arithmetic. What it got back was not a route to Asia. What it got back was something considerably larger, a claim on 2 continents that no one in Europe yet understood existed. The machinery of empire would now begin to move. Landfall and the world turned sideways. The people Columbus met on the beach had no way of knowing what had just arrived. The Taino, the indigenous inhabitants of the islands that Columbus encountered across his first months in the Caribbean, were not a simple or primitive people, though they would be described that way repeatedly in the accounts that followed. They lived in organized villages governed by chiefs called caciques, cultivated crops of cassava, sweet potato, and maize, fished the coastal waters with skill, and had developed trade networks that stretched across the island chains of the Caribbean. Their world was not static. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was simply there, functioning on its own terms, in the same way it had been for centuries. Columbus's journal entries from those first days record a kind of delighted bewilderment. He noted the Taino's physical appearance, their copper-coloured skin, their lack of iron weapons, their apparent openness. He noted, with something between observation and calculation, that they carried small pieces of gold as ornaments. He asked, through signs and gestures, where the gold came from, and they pointed vaguely toward the interior of larger islands. He recorded that they seemed to have no religion he could identify, which he interpreted as meaning they could be converted without resistance. He gave them red caps and glass beads, which they accepted with what he read as gratitude, and he took several of them aboard his ships to bring back to Spain as evidence. From the Bahamas, Columbus sailed southward and westward, moving through the island chain, searching for the mainland of Asia he was certain lay nearby. He touched the coast of Cuba and became briefly convinced that it was Japan. He moved on to a large island he named La Española, which later came to be called Hispaniola, and found evidence there of more gold in local use. Relations with the Taino were cautious but not immediately violent. There was trade, there was curiosity on both sides, and there was the kind of mutual incomprehension that tends to get papered over when everyone wants something from the other. Then, on December the 25th, 1492, the Santa Maria ran aground on a reef off the northern coast of Hispaniola and could not be saved. This accident, which might have ended the expedition in disaster, became instead an act of improvisation. Columbus used the timber from the wrecked ship to build a small fortified settlement on the coast, which he named La Navidad, the Nativity, for the day the ship was lost. He left 39 men there with instructions to collect gold and keep peaceful relations with the local Taino chief, whose name was Guacanagari, and who had, in fact, sent his own people to help salvage the Santa Maria's cargo. Columbus sailed back to Spain in January of 1493 on the Nina, carrying a modest amount of gold, samples of plants, and several Taino people who had not agreed to the voyage. His return to Spain was a carefully managed piece of public theatre. He wrote a letter describing his discoveries and arranged for it to be printed and circulated across Europe before he even arrived at court. When he met with Isabella and Ferdinand in Barcelona, he brought with him the Taino he had brought from the Caribbean, parrots, unfamiliar plants, and enough gold to make the meeting feel like the beginning of something enormous. The Catholic monarchs received him with full ceremony, addressed him by his new titles, and immediately began organizing a second expedition. The second voyage departed in September of 1493. This time there was nothing tentative about the scale. 17 ships carried approximately 1,200 men, not sailors and navigators only, but farmers, priests, craftsmen, soldiers, and administrators. The Crown was not sending another exploratory probe. It was sending the skeleton of a colony. When Columbus arrived back at Hispaniola and sailed to the site of La Navidad, he found the settlement burned to the ground and all 39 men dead. What had happened was reconstructed only partially from Taino accounts. The men Columbus had left behind had not maintained peaceful relations. They had demanded gold, taken women, and spread out across the surrounding countryside in search of more of both. The local population had eventually responded with violence. Guacanagari, the chief who had helped Columbus before, claimed to have played no part in it, but the goodwill of the first meeting was gone. Columbus moved the settlement to a new site on the northern coast of Hispaniola and named it La Isabella. It was the first permanent European town in the Americas, and it was, by most accounts, a miserable place. The site was poorly chosen, the soil was not as productive as hoped, disease moved through the colonists quickly, and the men who had come expecting easy gold were instead being put to work, building walls and clearing land. Columbus was an extraordinary navigator, but a poor colonial administrator, a fact that would become increasingly difficult to ignore over the following years. The search for gold intensified. Columbus imposed a tribute system on the Taino population of Hispaniola, requiring each adult to deliver a fixed quantity of gold to Spanish collectors every 3 months. Those who failed to deliver had their hands cut off. This was not an aberration. It was a policy, applied systematically, enforced by men who had crossed an ocean and were determined not to return empty-handed. The Taino population of Hispaniola at the time of Columbus's arrival is estimated by modern historians at somewhere between several 100,000 and several million people. The exact number is debated, but what is not debated is what happened next. Within 50 years, the Taino of Hispaniola had effectively ceased to exist as a population. Disease, smallpox, measles, typhus, illnesses to which they had no previous exposure and no immunity did the largest share of the destruction. Violence and the brutal conditions of forced labor did much of the rest. It was one of the most rapid demographic collapses in recorded history, and it established a pattern that would repeat itself, with variations, across virtually every region of the Americas that Spain entered. Columbus made 4 voyages in total. On his third, in 1498, he reached the mainland of South America for the first time, the coast of what is now Venezuela, and recorded in his journal that the volume of fresh water flowing from the Orinoco River into the sea was so enormous that it could only come from a continent-sized landmass. He began to describe it as a new world, though he still did not fully abandon the idea that Asia lay nearby. On his 4th and final voyage between 1502 and 1504, he explored the coast of Central America, still searching for a passage through to the Indian Ocean. He never found it. He died in 1506 in Valladolid, Spain, no longer viceroy, stripped of his governorship of Hispaniola years earlier after complaints from colonists about his administration, and still arguing that the crown had not fully honoured its agreements with him. The name attached to the continents he had reached was not his. It came from an Italian navigator named Amerigo Vespucci, who had sailed along the South American coast and written accounts clearly arguing that what Columbus had found was not Asia, but a landmass entirely new to European knowledge. A German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller, working in 1407, printed a map that labelled the southern continent America in Vespucci's honour. The name stuck. Columbus's name went to a country in South America and a river and a district, which is a reasonable consolation, though almost certainly not what he would have preferred. What Columbus had actually set in motion was still only beginning to be understood. The Caribbean islands were now Spanish territory, the Taino were dying, and the men who had come looking for gold were looking further, deeper, west and south, toward mainland shores that their maps showed only as blank edges. The next generation of Spaniards would go much further in, and would find something far larger than gold, the men who came after. The word conquistador carries a certain weight in history, a suggestion of armoured, sword-bearing figures moving through jungle and mountain with unstoppable purpose. The reality was considerably more complicated and considerably more human than the image tends to allow. Most conquistadors were not wealthy men. This is one of the more important things to understand about them, because their motivations were shaped almost entirely by that fact. The Spanish social system of the time had a category for men like them. Hidalgo, a minor nobleman, someone whose family had a name but not necessarily land or income to go with it. The word itself is a compression of hijo de algo, son of something. It meant you had a claim to status, but not always the means to support it. In a country that had just finished 8 centuries of warfare and was now at peace, there were a great many men with military training, social ambition, and very limited prospects. The region of Extremadura, in western Castile, produced a disproportionate share of the men who would cross the Atlantic and carve out the Spanish Empire in the Americas. It was a dry, hard landscape good for raising tough people, less good for raising much else. Hernán Cortés was from Medellín, in Extremadura. Francisco Pizarro was from Trujillo. Hernando de Soto, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, Pedro de Valdivia, the list goes on. These men shared a frontier upbringing, a culture shaped by the Reconquista's assumptions about land, violence, and religious sanction, and a clear-eyed understanding that the Caribbean offered something Spain itself could not: the possibility of starting over at a higher level. The mechanisms of that ambition were not purely personal. There was a legal and institutional framework, loose and often ignored in practice, but formally in place, that governed how conquest was supposed to work. The Crown did not directly fund most expeditions. Instead, a would-be conquistador would enter into a contract called a capitulación with the Crown, outlining what he intended to do, what share of any wealth discovered would go to the royal treasury, always 20%, known as the royal fifth, or quinto real, and what titles and privileges he would receive in return. The conquistador then had to find his own money, his own men, and his own ships. If he succeeded, the crown benefited handsomely. If he failed, the loss was his. This arrangement produced a particular kind of man, someone willing to mortgage his future on a gamble, comfortable with violence and privation, and entirely focused on results, because the alternative was debt and failure, and the long embarrassment of returning to Spain with nothing. It also produced a culture of internal competition and betrayal that would plague Spanish colonial ventures for generations. Conquistadors turned on their rivals as readily as they turned on indigenous populations. Partnership agreements dissolved into murder when gold was actually found. The history of the conquest is as much a story of Spaniards killing each other as it is of Spaniards killing anyone else. The legal justification for conquest had its own particular logic. In 1513, Spanish jurists produced a document called the Requerimiento, the Requirement. It was a formal text that, under Spanish law, was required to be read aloud to indigenous populations before any military action could be taken against them. The document explained the history of Christianity, the authority of the Pope, and the Pope's donation of their lands to the Spanish crown, and then gave the listeners the option of peacefully accepting this arrangement. If they refused, or if they were confused, or could not hear, or did not speak Spanish, which was almost universally the case, the Spanish were legally authorized to make war on them and enslave them, and any resulting harm was, formally, their own fault. The document was sometimes read from ships offshore. It was sometimes read to empty jungle. It was occasionally read at night, to sleeping villages, before dawn attacks. Spanish priests and lawyers argued, sometimes with genuine feeling, about its ethical coherence. Bartolomé de las Casas, a priest who had himself participated in early Caribbean colonization before becoming its most vocal critic, described the Requerimiento as a piece of legal theatre that made a mockery of the principles it claimed to uphold. The conquistadors who were actually using it generally agreed, which was precisely why they liked it. It gave them a document. The role of the Catholic Church in the conquest was neither purely cynical nor purely idealistic. Priests travelled with virtually every expedition, often under genuine obligation to minister to indigenous converts. The Franciscan and Dominican orders in particular saw the Americas as an extraordinary missionary opportunity. Tens of millions of souls who had never heard the Christian gospel available for conversion on a scale that dwarfed anything possible in Europe. Some of these priests became fierce critics of colonial violence precisely because they took conversion seriously and understood that torture and enslavement were not effective methods of producing sincere religious belief. But the Church also provided the intellectual framework that made the whole enterprise feel legitimate. The papal bull Inter Caetera, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, had granted Spain rights to the lands Columbus had found on the condition that the indigenous inhabitants be converted to Christianity. This made every expedition simultaneously a military campaign and a religious mission, a combination that gave even the most brutal operations a moral vocabulary they could use publicly. Vasco Núñez de Balboa demonstrated what this machinery could produce when it worked in its own terms. Balboa had arrived in Hispaniola in 1500 as a settler, accumulated debts, tried farming without success, and eventually stowed away on a supply ship to the Panama coast to escape his creditors, a detail that his later reputation has largely swallowed. He was resourceful enough to take effective leadership of a struggling settlement at Darien on the Isthmus of Panama, and shrewd enough to cultivate relations with local indigenous leaders who gave him information about what lay further south and west. In September of 1513, Balboa led a party of roughly 190 Spaniards and several hundred indigenous allies across the spine of the isthmus, through dense jungle and over mountains. On September the 25th of that year, a local guide told him the ocean was visible from the peak ahead. Balboa went up alone, looked south, and became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the Americas. 4 days later, he waded into the water in full armour and formally claimed possession of the Pacific and all lands touching it for the crown of Castile. It was an audacious gesture, given that he had no particular authority to do it, and that the Pacific is the largest ocean on Earth, but it was very much in keeping with the spirit of the age. What all of these men shared, Balboa, Cortes, Pizarro, the dozens of lesser figures who crossed the Atlantic in the 1500s, was a specific mental attitude toward the world they were entering. They were not explorers in the modern sense, motivated primarily by curiosity. They were operators, moving through unknown territory with a very clear sense of what they were looking for: gold, land, labour, and the social elevation that came from securing all three. Indigenous peoples were, in their framework, simultaneously an obstacle, a resource, and a potential labour force categories that could shift depending on the immediate circumstances. Disease travelled with them in a way they did not understand and could not control. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza spread from Spanish contact points outward through indigenous trade networks, sometimes arriving in regions weeks or months before any Spaniard did, killing populations that the conquistadors would later describe as mysteriously sparse. The epidemics were not a deliberate weapon. The germ theory of disease was 300 years away, but their effect was as decisive as any military campaign. By 1519, 27 years after Columbus's first landing, the Caribbean islands were Spanish colonies. The Taino of Hispaniola were nearly gone, and the Spanish had established footholds along the coasts of Central and South America. Cuba had been settled. Puerto Rico and Jamaica were under Spanish control. The governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez de Cuellar, was organizing expeditions toward the mainland coast of Mexico, where traders and shipwreck survivors had begun to bring back accounts of a large, organized civilization somewhere in the interior. He chose a man named Hernan Cortes to lead the next expedition. He would regret that decision almost immediately. Cortes and the fall of Tenochtitlan. Hernan Cortes was 33 years old when he sailed for Mexico, and he was already operating outside his legal authority before the ships left the harbour. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, had appointed Cortes to lead a new expedition to the Mexican coast, and then changed his mind. Velázquez had received reports that Cortes was too ambitious, too independent, too likely to pursue his own agenda at the expense of the governor's authority. He tried to revoke the commission. Cortes, who had spent considerable money organizing the expedition and had no intention of giving it up, simply accelerated his departure. In February of 1519, he sailed before Velázquez could stop him, with 11 ships, roughly 550 men, 16 horses, and 14 cannons. This act of deliberate insubordination defined everything that followed. Cortes was not operating as a representative of the Cuban colonial government. He was operating as a man who had cut his own authority loose from its moorings and would have to justify himself directly to the crown, which meant he needed results dramatic enough to make the irregularity of his position irrelevant. From the moment he sailed out of Cuban waters without authorization, failure was not an option he could afford. He landed on the Mexican coast in April of 1519 and immediately made a decision that was either strategically brilliant or simply useful. He founded a town. He called it Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, the rich town of the True Cross, and appointed his own men as its governing council. That council then formally appointed Cortes as their captain general, answering directly to the crown. It was a legal maneuver of impressive circularity, essentially creating an authority structure from scratch so that Cortes could be appointed by it. He then sent a ship directly to King Charles I of Spain, who was also Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, carrying detailed reports, gifts from the coast, and a carefully written explanation of everything he had done and why it was entirely within the law. A few weeks later, to prevent his men from sailing back to Cuba and reporting his insubordination to Velázquez, he scuttled his ships. The first people Cortes encountered who significantly shaped his campaign were not the Aztec. Along the coast, He made contact with the Totonac people of the region around what is now Veracruz, who were subjects of the Aztec Empire and deeply unhappy about it. They paid heavy tribute cacao, textiles, rubber, jade to Tenochtitlan, and they resented it. Cortés learned this through an interpreter who would become the single most consequential figure in the entire conquest, a young Nahuatl-speaking woman named Malintzin, who had been given to the Spanish as a slave after an early coastal encounter, and who spoke both Nahuatl and the Mayan language already known to one of Cortés's other interpreters. She became known to the Spanish as Doña Marina, and later to history as La Malinche. Her ability to speak directly to Aztec messengers, translate Moctezuma's words, and advise Cortés on the political landscape of the interior was, by any honest accounting, as important to the conquest as the horses or the cannons. Marching inland toward Tenochtitlan, Cortés encountered the Tlaxcalans, a confederation of peoples who had maintained fierce independence from Aztec domination and had been fighting the Aztec for generations. After several days of hard battle which the Spanish barely survived, the Tlaxcalans made a calculation. These strangers were powerful. They were enemies of the Aztec, and an alliance with them was worth more than fighting them. The Tlaxcalans became the backbone of Cortés' real military force. By the time the Spanish marched toward Tenochtitlan, the column of roughly 500 Spaniards was accompanied by several thousand Tlaxcalan warriors. This is the detail that popular accounts of the conquest most frequently omit, and it is perhaps the most important one. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not a European victory over an indigenous civilization. It was, in substantial part, an indigenous victory over an indigenous empire, in which the Spanish played a critical and catalyzing role. Tenochtitlan itself, when the Spanish finally saw it in November of 1519, was unlike anything they had encountered. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco and connected to the surrounding shore by broad causeways, it was a city of somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, larger than any city in Spain at the time, larger than London or Paris. It had aqueducts carrying fresh water from the mainland. It had an enormous market at Tlatelolco, where tens of thousands of people traded daily in a system of organized commerce that Spanish witnesses described with unconcealed amazement. It had a ceremonial center dominated by the Templo Mayor, a great twin pyramidal structure where the Aztec conducted the religious rituals that sustained their understanding of the cosmos. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II received Cortés and his party with formal ceremony, meeting them on the causeway at the city's entrance with a procession of nobles and a formal exchange of gifts. Why Moctezuma received the Spanish rather than stopping them has been debated for centuries. Some accounts suggest he believed Cortés was a returning deity, the god Quetzalcoatl, whose return from the east had been foretold. Modern historians are largely skeptical of this explanation, which comes primarily from post-conquest sources shaped by Spanish interests. More likely, Moctezuma was making a political calculation. He brought the Spanish inside the city where he could observe and control them, while he gathered more information and assessed their military capabilities. Cortés, drawing on tactics used with some success along the coast, moved quickly. Within weeks of arriving in Tenochtitlan, he had taken Moctezuma hostage, a move breathtaking in its audacity, conducted in the very heart of a city of hundreds of thousands of people who were not, at that moment, Spanish allies. The arrangement held, uneasily, for several months. Then Cortés was forced to leave Tenochtitlan to deal with a new problem. Velázquez had sent a force of 900 men under a commander named Panfilo de Narváez to arrest him. Cortés marched to the coast, defeated Narváez with characteristic aggressiveness, and persuaded most of Narváez's men to join him instead. He was away from Tenochtitlan for several weeks. While he was gone, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado made a catastrophic decision. During a major Aztec religious festival, the festival of Toxcatl, Alvarado ordered an attack on the assembled Aztec nobility and priests, killing somewhere between several hundred and a few thousand people. The reasons he gave later were confused. He may have believed a conspiracy was forming, Or he may have simply panicked. Whatever the cause, the effect was immediate and severe. The population of Tenochtitlan rose against the Spanish garrison. Moctezuma, brought out to address his people and urge calm, was pelted with stones, whether by his own people in fury at his collaboration, or by the Spanish, or both, is one of the unresolved questions of the conquest, and died shortly afterward. Cortés returned to find the city in open revolt. On the night of June the 30th, 1520, a night the Spanish called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, the Spanish and their allies attempted to escape across the causeways in darkness and were met by Aztec warriors on every side. The causeway bridges had been removed. Men drowned in the lake, weighed down by gold they had looted and refused to abandon. Cortés reportedly wept under a tree at the edge of the lake, though the witnesses who recorded this were his own admirers, and the scene may have been somewhat reconstructed in retrospect. The Spanish lost perhaps half their number that night, but they were not finished. Cortés regrouped with the Tlaxcalans and spent the following months rebuilding his forces, constructing small boats to fight on the lake, and organizing what became a 3-month siege of Tenochtitlan. During that same period, smallpox introduced by one of Narvaez's men swept through the city with devastating speed. Cuitlahuac, who had led the Aztec resistance after Moctezuma's death, died of smallpox. The city's population was dying and fighting simultaneously. The siege ended on August the 13th, 1521. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured trying to escape by canoe across the lake. When Cortés met him, Cuauhtémoc reportedly touched the hilt of Cortés' dagger and said that he had done everything a king could do to defend his city, and asked to be killed. Cortés did not kill him then. He had Cuauhtémoc tortured later, trying to find hidden gold, and eventually had him executed on a later expedition. But that is a later chapter. Tenochtitlan was a ruin. 2 years of siege and disease and battle had left the island city largely destroyed. On its foundations, the Spanish would begin building a new city. They called it Mexico City. It became the capital of New Spain, and within a generation it would be one of the most important cities in the world, Pizarro and the Inca unraveling. Francisco Pizarro could not read or write. He was the illegitimate son of a minor military officer from Trujillo in Extremadura, raised without formal education, and had spent the better part of his adult life scrambling through the Caribbean and Central American colonies without achieving anything that would justify the years he had spent there. He was somewhere in his 50s when he launched the expedition that would make him famous. An old man by the standards of the conquest, toughened by decades of failed ventures and provincial obscurity. He had been present when Balboa crossed the isthmus and saw the Pacific. He had heard from indigenous traders along the coast accounts of a vast and fabulously wealthy empire somewhere to the south. He had made 2 previous attempts to find it, both of which had fallen apart through disease, starvation, and the near mutiny of men who had been promised gold and found only jungle. Before his 3rd attempt, he did something Cortés had done before him. He went directly to the crown. In 1529, Pizarro travelled to Spain and met with Queen Isabella's daughter, now known as Queen Juana, and with the Emperor Charles V's court at Toledo. He brought with him a few Peruvian natives he had collected on his 2nd voyage, some llamas animals no European had ever seen, and samples of gold and fine Inca textiles. The crown granted him the capitulación he needed, the right to conquer Peru, the title of governor and captain general of any lands he found, and the full structure of royal authorization that would make everything that followed legal, at least on paper. He returned to Panama and assembled his 3rd expedition. 168 men, 62 horses, 1 small cannon. By any reasonable military calculation, this was not enough to conquer an empire of 10 to 12 million people. But Pizarro had 2 advantages that his small numbers did not reveal: a continent still being swept by European diseases that had arrived ahead of him, and an Inca empire that had just finished tearing itself apart. The Inca state called Tawantinsuyu the Four Regions was the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas. Its territory stretched from what is now southern Colombia down through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and into Chile and Argentina, connected by an extraordinary road system of roughly 40,000 kilometers of paved path crossing mountains and desert. The Inca administered this territory through a sophisticated bureaucracy, a system of labor taxation called the mita, and a complex of storehouses that could support armies and populations through drought and disruption. It was, by the standards of any civilization, an impressive piece of statecraft, but in the years just before Pizarro arrived, a civil war had ripped through it. When the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac died of a disease, almost certainly smallpox, moving ahead of the Spanish in around 1527, he left no clearly designated heir. Two of his sons, Huasca, based in the traditional capital of Cusco, and Atahualpa, commanding armies in the north, went to war over the succession. By 1532, when Pizarro's men crossed into Inca territory, Atahualpa had won. Huascar was a prisoner, but the war had left the empire exhausted, its administrative structures strained, and significant portions of its population bitterly resentful of Atahualpa's northern faction. Pizarro marched his small force inland from the coast and up into the Andes, through country that should have been impossible to take by force. Atahualpa was aware of the Spanish. He had received reports of their presence on the coast and had chosen not to block their passage into the mountains. His reasons are not entirely clear. He may have been curious. He may have believed his army of 80,000 men, camped near the city of Cajamarca, made any direct threat from 168 strangers rather academic. The meeting at Cajamarca on November the 16th, 1532, is one of the most analysed events in the history of the conquest, and one of the most disturbing. Pizarro invited Atahualpa into the city's central plaza. Atahualpa arrived on a litter carried by elaborately dressed attendants, surrounded by thousands of his own soldiers. Pizarro had hidden his cavalry and infantry around the edges of the plaza. A priest named Vicente de Valverde approached Atahualpa carrying a Bible and a cross, and delivered a compressed version of the Requerimiento, the explanation of Christian authority, the Pope's donation of these lands to Spain, and the invitation to submit peacefully. Atahualpa listened through an interpreter, examined the Bible with interest, and threw it to the ground, possibly in contempt, possibly because he did not understand its significance to the Spanish, possibly both. Valverde called out to Pizarro that the terms had been rejected. Pizarro gave the signal. The Spanish cavalry charged from three sides. The cannon fired into the crowd. The infantry advanced with steel weapons into a mass of people armed largely with slings and clubs, who had no space to move and no expectation of what was happening. The slaughter in the plaza lasted perhaps 2 hours. Estimates of Inca casualties range from 2,000 to 7,000 dead. Spanish casualties numbered approximately 0. Atahualpa, pulled from his litter as it was cut down, was taken alive. What followed was a negotiation of almost surreal character. Atahualpa, sitting in Spanish captivity and clearly understanding that his life had a specific monetary value to his captors, made an offer. He would fill the room in which he was held, a large room, roughly 6 meters by 7 meters, with gold as high as his hand could reach. He would fill 2 adjacent rooms with silver. In return, he expected his freedom. The ransom was collected. Gold and silver objects poured in from across the empire. Sacred objects from temples, ornamental pieces, the wealth of the Inca state stripped from its institutional settings and melted down into ingots. The total came to approximately 24 tons of gold and silver combined, one of the largest single transfers of precious metal in recorded history. It was divided among Pizarro's men according to rank, with the royal fifth removed for the crown, and it made everyone present wealthy enough to retire comfortably. Pizarro did not release Atahualpa. He had him tried on charges of plotting rebellion, worshipping idols, and polygamy charges, assembled with the specific purpose of providing legal cover for what had already been decided. On July the 26th, 1533, Atahualpa was brought out to be executed. He had been sentenced to be burned alive, which in Inca belief would prevent the proper treatment of his body in the afterlife and cause him significant spiritual harm. A priest offered him an alternative. If he accepted Christian baptism, he would be strangled instead of burned, which was considered a more merciful death. Atahualpa accepted baptism, was given the Christian name Juan de Guayalcur, and was garroted. Pizarro then marched south to Cusco, the Inca capital, which he entered in November of 1533. The city was magnificent. Enormous stone temples, palaces, storehouses filled with goods representing the labour of millions. The Temple of the Sun, Coricancha, had its walls lined with sheets of gold. All of it was stripped. Pizarro installed a young Inca prince named Manco as a puppet emperor, intending to use him to administer the population while the Spanish extracted its wealth. Manco would eventually lead one of the most significant indigenous uprisings of the entire colonial period in 1536, surrounding Cusco with an army estimated in the hundreds of thousands. The siege lasted months. The Spanish held barely, and the revolt was eventually broken. Manco retreated into the jungle mountains and established an independent Inca state at Vilcabamba that survived for another 36 years. The partnership between Pizarro and his longtime associate Diego de Almagro, meanwhile, deteriorated into the kind of lethal competition that characterized so many conquistador ventures. Almagro led a brutal and ultimately fruitless expedition into Chile, returned with nothing, and blamed Pizarro for his failures. In 1538, Pizarro had Almagro captured, tried, and strangled, the same method used on Atahualpa. In 1541, a group of Almagro's followers broke into Pizarro's palace in Lima and stabbed him to death at his dining table. He was somewhere in his 60s. By the time Pizarro died, the Inca Empire had been effectively dismantled. Its road system, its administrative storehouses, its religious institutions, all absorbed, repurposed, or destroyed. What Spain had found in Peru was something beyond even the extravagant promises of conquest. A mountain of silver that would reshape the entire global economy. That mountain still lay ahead, building the machine. Conquest is a violent and chaotic event. Empire is something else entirely. It is the attempt to make that violence permanent, organized, and profitable on a sustained basis. Spain, to its considerable credit as an administrative power, understood the difference and spent much of the 16th century trying to build the institutions that would transform a series of military victories into a functioning colonial system. That it succeeded, imperfectly and brutally, is remarkable. That the system it built caused enormous suffering is also true. Both things require attention. The central problem facing the Spanish crown from the earliest days of Caribbean colonization was one of control. Not control over indigenous peoples, but control over its own settlers. The men who crossed the Atlantic were not employees of the crown. They were independent operators who had taken enormous personal risks and expected enormous personal rewards. Left to themselves, they tended to treat the indigenous population as a personal resource to be used until exhausted, with no particular regard for what the crown needed from a functioning colonial economy over the long term. The encomienda system was the crown's first major attempt to impose a structure on this situation. An encomienda was a grant made by royal authority, entrusting a certain number of indigenous people to a Spanish settler, the encomendero, who was required to protect them and ensure their instruction in Christianity in exchange for their labour and tribute. In theory, it was a form of mutual obligation. In practice, it was forced labour dressed in legal language, and the conditions under which encomenderos extracted that labour varied from the merely exploitative to the genuinely murderous. The crown knew this. Almost from the beginning, there was a stream of reports from priests and officials describing the conditions in the colonies in terms that made uncomfortable reading in Madrid and Seville. The first formal legal attempt to address it came with the Laws of Burgos in 1512, a set of regulations governing the treatment of indigenous workers that included provisions about housing, food, rest days, and the prohibition of certain specific abuses. The laws of Burgos were largely ignored in practice, partly because enforcement mechanisms in colonies thousands of miles from Spain were minimal, and partly because the encomenderos who were supposed to be regulated were also the people most likely to be serving as local officials. The man who pushed hardest against this system, and who forced the crown to take the debate seriously, was a Dominican priest named Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas had himself been an encomendero in Cuba before undergoing what he described as a profound moral crisis while preparing to deliver a sermon in 1514. He gave up his encomienda, entered the Dominican order, and spent the next 50 years as the most vocal and persistent critic of the conquest in the Spanish-speaking world. His accounts of colonial violence, collected eventually in a book called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, completed in 1542, were graphic, detailed, and politically explosive. He intended them to be read by the crown, and they were. In 1542, under considerable pressure from Las Casas and others, the Emperor Charles V issued what became known as the New Laws. These regulations attempted to phase out the encomienda system over time, prohibiting the granting of new encomiendas and specifying that existing ones would revert to the crown upon the death of the current holder rather than passing to heirs. The response from colonial settlers was immediate and furious. In Peru, the opposition was violent enough that the first viceroy sent to enforce the laws, Blasco Núñez Vela, was captured by rebellious colonists and beheaded. The new laws were partially rolled back within a few years, though the principle that the crown held ultimate authority over colonial labour arrangements and that indigenous people were legally free subjects of the crown rather than slaves remained formally in place, however inconsistently enforced. What the crown built alongside these legal debates was a substantial bureaucratic architecture. The Council of the Indies, established in 1524 in Madrid, functioned as the supreme governing body for all Spanish overseas territories, reviewing legislation, appointing officials, hearing appeals, and issuing instructions to colonial governments across the Atlantic. It was an impressive institution and remarkably productive. It generated an extraordinary volume of legislation and correspondence, most of which is still preserved in the archive of the Indies in Seville. Below the council sat the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, established in Seville in 1503. All legal commerce between Spain and its American colonies was required to pass through Seville and be registered with the Casa, which controlled licenses, collected taxes, trained pilots, maintained charts, and monitored the movement of silver. It made Seville the commercial nerve centre of the empire for well over a century, and it made the city fabulously wealthy and, eventually, hopelessly congested. The colonies themselves were divided into two main administrative units: the Viceroyalty of New Spain, established in 1535 with its capital in Mexico City, and the Viceroyalty of Peru, established in 1542, with its capital in Lima. Each was governed by a viceroy appointed by the crown, a senior nobleman who served as the king's representative, with wide authority over civil and military affairs but subject to review and recall by Madrid. Below the viceroys sat a network of audiencias high courts that also functioned as administrative bodies, and below those, local officials called corregidors who governed specific towns and districts, collecting tribute and overseeing the indigenous population. The Catholic Church operated simultaneously as a parallel institution within this structure. The Spanish crown held, through a papal grant called the Patronato Real, the right to appoint bishops and control the Church's institutional operations in the Americas. This made the Church an arm of colonial government, while also giving it the autonomy to be its most persistent internal critic. The various religious orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and later the Jesuits divided the Americas among themselves as missionary territories, and set about the work of conversion with genuine energy and, in many cases, genuine learning. Franciscan missionaries in New Spain developed grammars and dictionaries of Nahuatl and other indigenous languages, understanding that conversion required communication. A Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades collecting Aztec history, religion, and cultural practice from indigenous informants, producing a 12-volume work called the Florentine Codex that remains one of the most important sources for pre-conquest Mesoamerican civilization. The irony that the Spanish conquest simultaneously destroyed indigenous civilization and produced the most detailed documentation of it was not lost on everyone involved. The great debate between Las Casas and the scholar Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, conducted at Valladolid in 1550 and 1551, before a panel of theologians and officials, crystallized the central moral question of the entire enterprise. Sepúlveda argued that indigenous peoples were natural inferiors, drawing on Aristotle's concept of natural slavery, and that conquest was therefore morally justified. Las Casas argued with equal force that indigenous peoples were fully rational human beings, that the conquest was unjust, and that Spain had no legitimate right to their territory or labour. The panel never issued a formal verdict. The debate was, in a sense, unresolvable within the framework in which it was conducted, because the answer that Las Casas's argument actually implied that Spain should leave the Americas was one that no one with actual power was prepared to accept. The colonies were generating too much, and the machinery was already too deeply embedded to be reversed. What the machine produced, over generations, was a layered colonial society built on indigenous labour, organised by Spanish law, administered by officials appointed in Madrid, and blessed by a church that prayed for the souls of the people whose lives the system was consuming. It was, by any honest measure, a system of exploitation. It was also, by the standards of 16th century statecraft, one of the most extensively regulated and legally contested systems of colonial rule that any European power had yet attempted. That distinction offered limited comfort to the people at the bottom of it, the mountain that ate men. In April of 1545, a Quechua herder named Diego Hualpa was caught overnight on the slopes of a great reddish mountain in the Bolivian highlands and lit a fire to keep warm. According to the account that was told afterward and retold often enough that its exact truth is difficult to verify, the fire melted something in the rock beneath it, and a thin rivulet of silver ran out across the ground. The mountain was called Sumac Urca in Quechua. The Spanish called it Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. It was, as mountains go, extraordinarily well named. Within a year of that discovery, a mining camp had appeared at the mountain's base. Within a decade, that camp had become a city. By the 1600s, the city of Potosí, sitting at an altitude of nearly 4,900 meters in the Andes, so high that the thin air made breathing difficult, and newcomers spent their first weeks dizzy and nauseated, had a population of somewhere between 160,000 and 200,000 people. That made it larger than London at the time, larger than Rome, larger than Madrid. It was one of the largest cities on earth, built around a hole in a mountain in one of the most inhospitable environments on the continent. Potosi was not the only source of American silver. The mines at Zacatecas in Mexico, discovered in 1546, were enormous producers, but Potosi was in a category of its own. The mountain was not merely silver-rich. It was, by geological accident, one of the most concentrated deposits of silver ore ever found. A natural formation that happened to intersect with the particular moment in history when the Spanish Empire needed exactly that kind of resource, and had the coercive machinery to extract it. The extraction process went through two phases. In the early decades, the ore was rich enough to be smelted directly using traditional indigenous wind furnaces called huayras, which dotted the hillsides around the mountain at night like a field of candles. Then, in the 1550s and 60s, the ore grade began to decline. The easy silver near the surface was gone. What remained required a new method. That method arrived in the form of mercury amalgamation, a technique introduced to New Spain by a refiner named Bartolomé de Medina in 1554 and adapted for Potosí shortly after. The process involved grinding the silver ore into a fine powder, mixing it with mercury which bonded selectively with silver, and then heating the resulting amalgam to drive off the mercury as vapor, leaving refined silver behind. It was technologically effective and economically transformative. It was also extraordinarily toxic. The mercury came primarily from the mines at Huancavelica in Peru, which were themselves worked under brutal conditions, and which produced a steady supply of the poisonous liquid metal that made Potosí's deeper ore economically viable. Mercury poisoning moved through the mine workforce in a well-documented progression: tremors, neurological damage, tooth loss, eventual death. The men who carried mercury and processed ore breathed it, absorbed it through their skin, and drank water contaminated by it. A worker who spent years at Potosí or Huancavelica paid for the silver with his body. The labor force that worked the mines was organized under a system the Spanish adapted from the Inca mita, the pre-existing obligation of Andean communities to contribute labor to state projects. The colonial version, also called the mita, required that roughly 1/7 of the adult male indigenous population from a defined region of highland Peru and Bolivia report to Potosí each year for a rotation of work. This meant tens of thousands of men descending into the mines each year, drawn from communities hundreds of kilometers away, forced to bring their own food and tools, paid wages that rarely covered their expenses, and working shifts of up to a week underground at a stretch without returning to the surface. The demographic impact was devastating. Communities subject to the mita found their male populations systematically drained. Men who could afford to pay a cash exemption did so. Those who could not went. Whole villages relocated outside the mita's legal catchment area to escape it. The indigenous population of the Andean highlands, already devastated by disease, declined sharply under the additional pressure of forced mine labor. Estimates of the total death toll at Potosí over the colonial period vary widely. Some contemporary Spanish accounts spoke of 8 million dead over the mine's history, a figure that later historians have debated and partially questioned, but which reflects the genuine understanding at the time that the mountain was consuming people at a terrible rate. A common Spanish phrase entered circulation: "Vale un Potosí worth a Potosí," meaning something of almost inconceivable value. The phrase did not mention what Potosí cost. The silver that came out of the mountain flowed in two directions. A portion, the royal fifth, the quinto real, went directly to the Spanish crown. The rest moved through licensed merchants, was registered at the Casa de Contratación in Seville, and entered the European economy. Between roughly 1500 and 1800, scholars estimate that the Americas produced approximately 85% of the world's silver. The majority of that came from Potosí and Zacatecas. It was a flood of precious metal on a scale Europe had never experienced, and it had effects that no one in Madrid or Seville fully anticipated. The most immediate was inflation. When the supply of money increases dramatically but the supply of goods does not keep pace, prices rise. This is a basic economic relationship, and in 16th century Europe, where economic theory was still largely medieval, very few people understood what was happening or why. Prices across Western Europe roughly tripled or quadrupled over the course of the 1500s and early 1600s, a slow, grinding inflation that economists later named the price revolution. Wages did not keep pace, fixed rents became less valuable, the purchasing power of ordinary workers declined steadily. The silver that had been extracted at such cost from an Andean mountain redistributed wealth across Europe in ways that disadvantaged labourers and advantaged merchants and landowners who could raise prices on what they sold. For Spain itself, the paradox was particularly sharp. The silver coming in from the Americas was so enormous that the Spanish crown used it as collateral to borrow heavily from European banking families, particularly the Fuggers of Augsburg and later the Genoese banking networks. Rather than building a domestic economy capable of producing goods and generating wealth internally, Spain increasingly bought what it needed from other European countries using American silver. Dutch and English and Italian manufacturers sold textiles, weapons, and finished goods to Spain, which paid in silver that then circulated through those economies and funded their growth. Spain's domestic manufacturing sector, rather than developing under the pressure of imperial demand, was undercut by cheaper imports. The Crown declared bankruptcy in 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647, 6 times in roughly 90 years. Each time, the silver kept coming in, and each time, the debts and military commitments outpaced it. The empire was generating extraordinary wealth and somehow remaining perpetually broke, a contradiction that baffled contemporaries and has fascinated economists ever since. At Potosi, through all of this, the mountain continued to be worked. New shafts went deeper, the meter rotations continued, the mercury processing continued. The mountain's profile, a near-perfect cone, rising above the high plateau, became the most recognizable symbol of colonial extraction in the Americas, printed on maps and described in books read across Europe. The city at its base had churches, a mint, a market, theatres, and a permanent floating population of merchants, priests, lawyers, prostitutes, gamblers, and indigenous workers who had walked hundreds of kilometres to fulfill an obligation they had not chosen. It was one of the defining places of the Spanish Empire, and one of the most complete illustrations of what the empire actually ran on. The world made Spanish. By the middle of the 1600s, the Spanish Empire in the Americas had been running for roughly a century and a half. Long enough for something that had begun as a series of violent military expeditions to solidify into something more recognizable as a civilization, layered, contradictory, genuinely creative in some ways, and organized around a hierarchy of race and origin that shaped virtually every aspect of daily life. Understanding what colonial Spanish America actually looked like, how people dressed, what they ate, where they lived, and what their days contained requires looking at the society from several levels at once, because the experience varied enormously depending on where you stood within it. At the top sat the peninsulars, people born in Spain who had crossed the Atlantic to take up administrative, religious, or commercial positions in the colonies. They were relatively few in number but held disproportionate formal authority. A peninsula could expect to hold high office in ways that colonial-born Spaniards could not, a distinction that generated resentment that would simmer for 200 years before boiling over in the independence movements of the early 1800s. Peninsulares dressed according to current Spanish fashion doublets, ruffs, cloaks and stockings for men of standing, elaborate gowns with high collars and fitted bodices for women, and maintained their Iberian identity with a deliberateness that was partly cultural pride and partly political positioning. Directly below them in social standing, and enormously more numerous, were the Criollos people of full or near-full Spanish descent, born in the Americas. By the 1600s, Criollo families had been in the Americas for 3 or 4 generations, had built substantial wealth through land ownership, mining, and trade, and had developed a distinct sense of belonging to their American cities and regions that sometimes surprised visitors from Spain. Criollo men wore European fashions adapted for local climates, lighter fabrics in the tropical lowlands, heavier wool in the Andean highlands. Criollo women, particularly in wealthy urban households, were known for elaborate personal adornment, imported silks, lace mantillas, and quantities of jewellery in gold and silver that reflected the proximity of the mines. The great Criollo households of Mexico City and Lima had servants, formal dining rooms, private chapels and libraries. Then came the mestizos people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry, whose numbers grew steadily throughout the colonial period, as the social boundaries between communities blurred in the complex ways that always accompany sustained contact. The mestizo population occupied a complicated middle position, above indigenous people in the official hierarchy, below criollos, and subject to a range of legal restrictions and social suspicions that made their position unstable and often frustrating. In practice, the line between a light-skinned mestizo who presented himself as criollo and an actual criollo was often more theoretical than real, and colonial society was full of people quietly repositioning themselves within the racial categories the system provided. The indigenous population, the indios, in colonial terminology formed the broad base of the whole structure. They paid tribute, provided the bulk of the agricultural and mining labour, and lived under a separate legal regime from Spanish colonists. In rural areas, many indigenous communities retained significant internal autonomy, governing themselves through their own traditional leaders, now called caciques or gobernadores, who served as intermediaries between their communities and the colonial administration. Indigenous men in these communities typically wore the traditional dress of their region, adapted over generations to incorporate Spanish-introduced materials like wool from the sheep and cattle the Spanish had brought. Women maintained traditional textile traditions. With remarkable persistence, the weaving patterns of Andean and Mesoamerican communities survived the conquest and continue to this day. African people, brought to the Americas as enslaved laborers to supplement and eventually partially replace the declining indigenous workforce, formed another layer of this society. By around 1600, there were approximately 75,000 enslaved Africans in Spanish America, concentrated particularly in the Caribbean islands, coastal lowlands of Mexico and Peru, and the port cities. Enslaved people in urban settings sometimes had more mobility than those on agricultural estates working as skilled artisans, domestic servants, and vendors, but remained property under the law, with their lives entirely subject to their owners' decisions. Free black and mixed African-Spanish communities, known as mulattos and pardos, occupied positions of social ambiguity, similar in some ways to that of mestizos, defined as much by what they were not allowed to do as by what they were. The colonial authorities attempted to codify all of this into a formal system of racial classification called the Sistema de Castas, the caste system. A Spaniard and an indigenous woman produced a mestizo. A Spaniard and a mestizo produced a castizo. A mestizo and an indigenous person produced a coyote. The categories proliferated into dozens of increasingly elaborate designations, illustrated in a genre of painting pinturas de castas that depicted these combinations as nearly scientific taxonomy. Wealthy colonial families sometimes commissioned these paintings as demonstrations of their own racial genealogy and social position. They are now among the most visually striking documents of colonial social anxiety ever produced. The cities themselves were designed to make this hierarchy visible. Spanish colonial cities were typically built on a grid plan, centered on a plaza mayor, a main square surrounded by the cathedral, the government palace, and the most important commercial buildings. The cathedral occupied the largest and most prominent position, almost always built on or near the site of a pre-existing indigenous ceremonial center, a spatial statement about which religion had replaced which. Mexico City's great cathedral was built on the ruins of the Aztec Templo Mayor, using stones from the demolished temple as building material. The Plaza Mayor was where colonial life converged daily. Markets, public executions, religious processions, festivals, and political announcements all took place there. The social order was performed in these spaces: who wore what, who walked where, who bowed to whom, in a continuous daily theatre of hierarchy. Food in colonial Spanish America was a genuine synthesis, though one that arrived through unequal contact. Indigenous foods, maize tortillas, beans, chili peppers, tomatoes, cacao, potatoes, squash remained the daily staples of the indigenous and mestizo populations. The Spanish introduced wheat, which they preferred for bread, and which carried enormous cultural weight as the grain of the Eucharist, along with cattle, pigs, chickens, sheep, olive oil, wine, and sugar. In wealthy Criollo and Peninsular households, meals were elaborate affairs modelled on Iberian tradition: roasted meats, wheat bread, wine from Chilean or Peruvian vineyards, and sweets made with sugar from Caribbean plantations. Street food in colonial cities, sold by indigenous and mestizo vendors, blended these traditions in ways that were entirely practical and entirely new: tamales stuffed with pork, sauces combining Old World spices with New World chili peppers, chocolate mixed with cinnamon and sugar into the drink that Spanish missionaries first encountered in Aztec courts and then carried back to Europe, where it became a fashionable luxury. The rhythm of daily life was organized almost entirely around the Catholic Church calendar. Feast days, saints' days, Lent, Easter, Corpus Christi the year, was punctuated by religious observances that were also social events, breaking the monotony of agricultural or mining labour with processions, markets, music and food. The Church built not only cathedrals but universities. The University of Mexico and the University of Lima were both established in 1551, making them among the oldest universities in the Western Hemisphere. They trained priests, lawyers, and physicians, and produced a genuine colonial intellectual culture. That culture had its complications. Colonial intellectuals worked within a framework of censorship and inquisitorial oversight that limited what could be published or debated, but it also produced genuine brilliance. A Criollo woman named Juana Inés de la Cruz, born in 1548 near Mexico City, entered a convent to pursue the intellectual life unavailable to women in secular society, and became one of the finest poets and philosophical writers of the entire Spanish-speaking world. That she had to become a nun to access a library says something important about the world she lived in. The empire Spain built in the Americas was not simply an extraction operation, though extraction was central to it. It was also a civilization architecturally ambitious, intellectually active in selective ways, culturally hybrid in ways its organizers had not planned for and could not fully control. It was built on violence and maintained by coercion, and it produced cathedrals and universities and poetry. All of those things are true simultaneously, and none of them cancels the others out. Galleons on every ocean. The Spanish Empire was, for a brief and extraordinary period in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the closest thing the world had yet produced to a genuinely global commercial network. Its silver moved from Andean mountains to Chinese markets. Its ships crossed both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Its ports connected 3 continents in a web of trade that, however violent and exploitative at its origins, created economic linkages that reshaped how goods and money moved across the entire planet. Understanding how that happened requires going back to a voyage that began in 1519, the same year. Cortés landed in Mexico and ended 3 years later with a single damaged ship limping into a Spanish harbour. Ferdinand Magellan was Portuguese, sailing under a Spanish commission when he led a fleet of 5 ships westward from Spain in September of 1519, with the goal of reaching Asia by continuing west, the route Columbus had theorized but never found. Magellan crossed the Atlantic, navigated the treacherous passage at the southern tip of South America that now bears his name, and crossed the Pacific Ocean, a voyage of nearly 4 months without sighting significant land, during which his crew ate rats and boiled leather to survive. He reached the Philippine Islands in March of 1521 and was killed there in April in a local conflict on the island of Mactan, his grand circumnavigation unfinished. A Basque navigator named Juan Sebastián Elcano took command of the remaining ship, the Victoria, and completed the voyage, arriving back in Spain in September of 1522 with 18 surviving men out of the original 260 who had set out. They had sailed around the world. Elcano received a coat of arms from the emperor that included a globe with the inscription, "You first circumnavigated me." Magellan received the credit in most subsequent histories, which is perhaps fair since the voyage was his conception, and perhaps slightly unfair to Elcano, who actually finished it. The circumnavigation proved that the Pacific could be crossed. What it did not immediately provide was a reliable route back. The prevailing winds that carried ships westward across the Pacific were not available for an eastward return. For several decades, Spanish ships could reach Asia but could not get back the same way. Early Spanish expeditions to the Philippines claimed for Spain and named in honor of Prince Philip, who became Philip II, were essentially one-way trips, with crews forced to return westward through the Indian Ocean and around Africa. The problem was solved in 1565 by an Augustinian friar and navigator named Andres de Urdaneta, who had the insight to sail far north into the Pacific before turning east. Picking up the westerly winds of the North Pacific Gyre that blow reliably toward the California coast. This route, the tourne voyage, the return voyage, made the Pacific a navigable round trip for the first time. In the same year, Miguel López de Legazpi established the first permanent Spanish settlement in the Philippines at Cebu, and within a few years the capital was established at Manila. The Manila galleon trade that followed ran, with remarkable consistency, for 250 years from 1565 to 1815. Once or twice each year, a large galleon, sometimes two, departed from Acapulco on the Mexican Pacific coast, carrying the one commodity that Asian markets wanted above all others, silver. American silver, minted in Mexico City or Lima from ore extracted at Zacatecas and Potosí, was the engine that made the entire system run. In Manila, the silver was exchanged for goods brought by Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants who converged on the city specifically because they knew the galleon was coming. The Chinese silk trade was the most important single-component bolts of silk that sold for a fraction of their European price in Manila, could be sold at enormous profit in Mexico City or shipped on to Spain. Chinese porcelain, lacquerware, ivory carvings, spices from the Moluccas, pepper from Java, cinnamon from Ceylon. The holds of returning galleons were packed with the luxury goods of Asia. The Chinese connection was particularly deep. China under the Ming dynasty had made silver the foundation of its monetary system and tax collection, but China produced relatively little silver domestically. American silver, flowing through Manila, became essential to the functioning of the Chinese imperial economy. Scholars estimate that somewhere between a third and half of all the silver produced in Spanish America between the 1500s and the 1800s eventually ended up in China. The global economy was, in a very real sense, running on Potosí's output. The Andean mountain was not merely enriching Spain but monetizing Asia. The Manila galleons themselves were extraordinary vessels among the largest wooden ships built anywhere in the world during their era. The great galleons of the late 16th and 17th centuries were constructed in the Philippines using tropical hardwoods far superior in durability to anything available in Europe or the Americas, and could carry several hundred tons of cargo. They were also floating fortresses because the Pacific route attracted exactly the kind of attention that enormous concentrations of valuable cargo tend to attract. English privateers, men like Francis Drake, who sailed into the Pacific in 1578 and raided Spanish shipping along the South American coast, were a persistent threat. Drake captured a treasure ship called the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, known to the Spanish as the Cacafuego, and returned to England with cargo so valuable that Queen Elizabeth I came personally to his ship to knight him. The Dutch, who became Spain's most serious commercial rivals in the 17th century, were even more systematic in their Pacific raiding, establishing their own trading network in Asia and directly competing with Spanish and Portuguese interests across the region. The dangers were not only human. The North Pacific route home was brutal, a voyage of 3 to 4 months across open ocean, with no possibility of resupply, through waters that produced sudden and violent storms. Ships that missed the California coast and were pushed off course could find themselves in serious trouble quickly. Over the 250 years of the trade, somewhere between 30 and 40 galleons were lost to storms, reefs, or enemy action. When a galleon went down, it took not only its cargo but its crew of several hundred men, including the indigenous Mexican and Filipino sailors who made up much of the working labour on these ships and who appear rarely in the historical record by name. The arrival of a galleon at Acapulco was one of the most significant economic events of the colonial calendar. A massive trade fair erupted in the port. Merchants from Mexico City travelled weeks overland to reach it, bringing currency and colonial goods to exchange for the Asian luxuries coming off the ship. Chinese silk was redistributed across New Spain and onward to Spain itself. Asian porcelain appeared in colonial households from Mexico to Peru. The global economy, before the word globalization existed, was doing what globalization does, moving goods from where they were cheap to where they were expensive, and creating dependencies in both directions. What is easy to miss in the scale of this commercial achievement is what it required at the human level. The silver that drove the entire system came from Potosí and Zacatecas, extracted by coerced labour under deadly conditions. The galleons were crewed by men who spent months at sea in conditions of extraordinary hardship. The Filipino workers who built the ships were organised under a labour system with uncomfortable similarities to the meter. The Chinese merchants in Manila's Parian, the designated district where they were required to live, separately from the Spanish colonial population, were periodically subjected to massacres when Spanish colonial authorities became anxious about their numbers and influence. The first truly global trade network was built on the same structural foundation as everything else the Spanish Empire produced: extracted resources, coerced labour, and a legal and institutional framework designed to ensure that the profits accumulated at the top of the hierarchy, while the costs were distributed across its bottom. It was, even so, genuinely remarkable. A system of commerce that connected Andean mountains to Chinese markets through Pacific storms and Philippine ports, creating economic relationships that neither Europe nor Asia had imagined possible a century before. The Armada and the cracks. Philip II of Spain was, by the 1580s, the most powerful monarch in the world. He had inherited from his father, Charles V, a domain that already included Spain, the Spanish Americas, the Kingdom of Naples, Sicily, and the Duchy of Milan. In 1580, he added Portugal and its entire overseas empire, Brazil, the African trading posts, the Indian Ocean network, the colonies in Asia, through a dynastic claim backed by military force. For a brief period, the crowns of Spain and Portugal sat on the same head, and the phrase used to describe Philip's realm required some effort to complete. It stretched from the Philippines to Peru, from the coast of Brazil to the ports of Goa. Philip governed all of this from a desk. He was a meticulous, deeply serious man who read and annotated every document that crossed his table, made decisions slowly and carefully, and corresponded personally with officials across 3 continents. His palace, the Escorial, a vast, austere granite complex northwest of Madrid, that he spent years designing and building, reflected his personality precisely: grand in scale, severe in decoration, organised around a private chapel where he could hear Mass through a window from his own bedroom. He was profoundly Catholic in a way that was not merely political but genuinely personal, and he believed with complete sincerity that the defence of Catholicism was the central purpose of his reign. England, under Elizabeth I, was Protestant. The Dutch provinces that Spain administered in the Low Countries, what are now the Netherlands and Belgium, were in open revolt, partially funded and encouraged by Elizabeth. English privateers, operating under licenses that gave them a semi-official status while maintaining the Queen's plausible deniability, were raiding Spanish shipping in the Caribbean and the Pacific with increasing boldness. Francis Drake had sailed into the harbour at Cadiz in 1587, and destroyed or captured somewhere around 30 Spanish ships sitting in port, an act of audacity that English writers celebrated as singeing the king of Spain's beard, and that Philip received with the controlled fury of a man who had decided something must be done. What Philip decided to do was build a fleet large enough to end the problem permanently. The armada he assembled was called, with the optimism of official nomenclature, La Grande y Felicissima Armada, the great and most fortunate fleet. It consisted of 130 ships and roughly 30,000 men, sailors, soldiers, servants, and priests, the largest naval force Spain had ever put to sea. The plan was straightforward in concept and catastrophically complicated in execution. The fleet would sail up the English Channel to the coast of Flanders, where the Duke of Parma commanded a veteran army of approximately 17,000 men. Parma's forces would board small transport vessels in the shallow Flemish ports, rendezvous with the Armada in the Channel, and cross to England under naval protection. The man Philip appointed to command this fleet was Alonso Perez de Guzman, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. Medina Sidonia was a capable administrator and a man of impeccable social standing, which were apparently the primary qualifications being considered. He wrote to Philip before the fleet sailed, pointing out with admirable honesty that he had no experience of naval command, that he suffered from seasickness, and that he genuinely felt he was the wrong choice for the job. Philip appointed him anyway, which says something about the communication culture of absolute monarchy that historians have been discussing ever since. The Armada left Lisbon in May of 1588 and immediately ran into trouble. Storms scattered the fleet before it reached the English Channel. It reassembled at the Spanish port of Coruña, took on more supplies, and set out again in July. By the time it entered the Channel, the English fleet was ready. The English ships, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham with Francis Drake serving as Vice-Admiral, were different in design. From the heavy Spanish galleons, lower, faster, more manoeuvrable, with longer-range guns that allowed them to engage at distances where the Spanish could not effectively respond. The English strategy was to avoid close boarding combat, where Spanish soldiers would have a decisive advantage, and instead hammer the Armada with cannon fire from range, disrupting its formation without committing to the kind of melee battle the Spanish were equipped to win. What followed was a week of running engagements up the Channel. The Spanish maintained their formation with considerable discipline, a defensive crescent that made it difficult for the English to break through, and the English guns, while accurate at range, could not penetrate the thick hulls of the Spanish galleons decisively. Neither side actually sank many of the other's ships in direct combat. The battle was less dramatic than its reputation suggests. The crisis came at Gravelines, off the Flemish coast, on August the 8th. The Armada had anchored off Calais, waiting to coordinate with Parma's army, and here the fundamental flaw in the plan became undeniable. Parma's soldiers were in shallow Flemish ports that the great Spanish galleons could not enter. The small transport boats Parma needed to reach the Armada were being blockaded by Dutch flyboats, nimble, shallow-draft vessels operating in coastal waters where the Spanish fleet could not follow. The rendezvous that the entire operation depended on could not happen. During the night, the English sent 8 fireships vessels loaded with pitch and combustibles and set alight drifting into the anchored Armada. The Spanish, unable to tell whether the fireships carried explosives, panicked and cut their anchor cables, scattering the fleet's careful formation. In the battle the following morning off Gravelines, the Spanish ships were disorganized and exposed, and the English inflicted the heaviest damage of the entire campaign. Several Spanish ships were driven onto shallow banks and wrecked. The Armada, unable to re-anchor because the cables had been cut, was pushed northward by the wind. There was no way back down the Channel. The English fleet blocked the southern route, and the wind was against them. The only option was to sail north around Scotland and then south around the western coast of Ireland, a route of thousands of kilometres through waters no Spanish pilot had charted. What the weather did to the fleet on that route was worse than anything the English had managed. Atlantic storms drove ships onto the rocky Irish coast, in a series of wrecks spread over hundreds of kilometers of coastline. Thousands of men drowned. Others reached shore, where some were helped by the Irish population and others were killed by English soldiers under strict orders to execute any Spaniards who landed. Roughly 67 ships made it back to Spain, out of 130 that had left. Approximately 20,000 men had died, most of them not in battle, but from storms, shipwreck, disease, and thirst during the long northern voyage. Philip, receiving the news at the Escorial, reportedly said that he had sent his fleet to fight men, not storms, and continued with his paperwork. He built another fleet the following year. A storm destroyed it before it reached England. He built another in 1597. Another storm. The ocean seemed to be making a point that Philip was not entirely prepared to absorb. The defeat of the Armada did not immediately alter the balance of power as dramatically as later accounts sometimes imply. Spain remained the dominant European power for another generation, its silver still flowing, its armies still the finest in Europe. But the campaign had revealed something important. The empire was overextended. It was fighting simultaneously in the Netherlands, in France, in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, and in the Pacific, maintaining commitments in every direction that its revenues, even supplemented by American silver, could barely sustain. Each new military adventure added debt without resolving the underlying strategic problem, which was that Spain had accumulated more territory and more enemies than any single monarchy could effectively defend. The cracks were there. They would take another century to become fractures. Silver, inflation, and the slow bleeding. Philip II died in 1598 after a reign of 42 years, leaving behind the largest empire in the world and a treasury that was, once again, effectively bankrupt. His son, Philip III, inherited both the empire and its contradictions and added a few of his own. Philip III was not an unintelligent man, but he was a deeply uninterested one. Where his father had governed through meticulous personal attention, reading every document and annotating every report, Philip III preferred to delegate. He chose as his chief minister a nobleman named Francisco Gómez de Sandoval y Rojas, the Duke of Lerma, and handed him effective control of the Spanish government for the better part of 2 decades. Lerma used this position with impressive thoroughness to enrich himself, his family, and his network of clients, accumulating one of the largest personal fortunes in Spain, while overseeing a foreign policy of cautious disengagement and a domestic policy of drift. When corruption charges eventually began to gather around him, Lerma solved the problem by arranging for the Pope to make him a cardinal, a stroke of administrative creativity that protected him from secular prosecution. He died peacefully in his own bed, a wealthy prince of the church. The institution of the valido, the royal favourite who governed in the king's name, became one of the defining features of 17th century Spain. It concentrated enormous power in the hands of men whose primary qualification was the king's personal affection, and it meant that the quality of Spanish government became tightly linked to the judgment of whoever happened to occupy that position at any given moment. The results were mixed, which is a polite way of saying they were often poor. Beneath the political drift at the top, the structural problems of the empire were compounding. The silver continued to arrive from the Americas, but the relationship between that silver and actual Spanish prosperity had become increasingly complicated. The core issue was one that economists would later describe as Dutch disease, a phenomenon where the abundance of a single valuable commodity hollows out the broader economy by making everything else relatively uncompetitive. Spain was importing manufactured goods, textiles, hardware, weapons, furniture from France, England, the Dutch Republic, and the Italian states, paying for them with American silver. Spanish domestic manufacturers could not compete with cheaper foreign goods, and rather than developing the industrial capacity that sustained wealth over the long term, Spain functioned increasingly as a conduit. Silver came in from the Americas, moved through Spanish hands, and ended up in the treasuries of the countries that actually made things. The Genoese bankers who financed Spain's military operations took a substantial portion. The rest dispersed across a European economy that used it more productively than Spain did. The Dutch were the clearest example of this dynamic in action. The Dutch Republic, which had been in open revolt against Spanish rule since 1568, in what became known as the 80 Years' War, was simultaneously fighting for its independence from Spain and becoming the most economically dynamic society in Europe. While Spain's American silver funded the armies trying to suppress the revolt, Dutch merchants were building the commercial infrastructure of a new kind of capitalist economy, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, a sophisticated banking system, and a merchant fleet that would eventually outnumber all other European fleets combined. The Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC, was a direct competitor to Spanish and Portuguese interests in Asia. It was the first company in history to issue public shares, allowing ordinary investors to buy stakes in its voyages and distribute both the risk and the profits. Within a generation, it had established trading posts across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, displacing Portuguese merchants from positions they had held for a century and capturing a significant portion of the Asian luxury trade that had previously flowed through the Manila galleons and Lisbon. The organizational innovation the Dutch brought to commerce was as consequential, in its own way, as any military technology. In 1609, Philip III made a domestic decision that historians have long identified as one of the more self-inflicted wounds of the period. He ordered the expulsion of the Moriscos, the descendants of Spanish Muslims who had converted to Christianity, officially, but who were suspected of practicing Islam in secret and of maintaining cultural loyalties that the crown found threatening. The expulsion was carried out over several years and removed somewhere around 300,000 people from Spain. Many of them were skilled farmers, artisans, and craftsmen concentrated in the agricultural regions of Valencia and Aragon. Their departure disrupted local economies, reduced tax revenues, and left agricultural land that had been meticulously cultivated under sophisticated irrigation systems suddenly in need of people who knew how to work it. The long-term economic damage was significant and largely self-inflicted. Philip IV, who came to the throne in 1621, inherited all of these accumulated problems and then added the 30 Years' War. That conflict, which began as a religious dispute within the Holy Roman Empire and gradually became a general European war involving nearly every major power, drew Spain in deeply, partly out of genuine religious commitment, partly out of dynastic obligation to the Austrian Habsburgs, and partly because the Spanish road, the overland route used to move troops from Spain through Italy and into the Spanish Netherlands, ran directly through territories that were now contested war zones. Philip IV's own valido, the Count Duke of Olivares, was considerably more capable than Lerma, a genuine statesman with a clear analysis of Spain's structural problems and ambitious reform plans to address them. Olivares understood that the empire's military commitments were outrunning its fiscal capacity, and that the solution required making the various regions of Spain, Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, Portugal contribute more equally to the common defence, rather than leaving Castile to bear most of the burden. His attempt to implement this through a proposal called the Union of Arms, which would have required each region to contribute troops and money proportional to its resources, produced exactly the political crisis he might have anticipated. In 1640, both Portugal and Catalonia revolted. Portugal, which had been united with Spain under Philip II in 1580, seized the opportunity provided by Spain's military overextension to break away permanently under a Portuguese nobleman named João IV of the House of Braganza. The Portuguese Restoration War that followed lasted 28 years, and Portugal never came back. Catalonia's revolt was eventually suppressed, but only after enormous military effort and at the cost of concessions that weakened Castile's control over the region. At the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Spain formally recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic acknowledging the outcome of a war it had been fighting for 80 years without winning. 11 years later, the Treaty of the Pyrenees ended a war with France and required Spain to cede territory to the French crown. Both treaties signalled something that contemporaries could already feel. The centre of European power was shifting. France, under Cardinal Richelieu and then Cardinal Mazarin and then Louis XIV, was becoming the dominant continental power. Spain was becoming something else, still large, still wealthy in theory, still the possessor of 2 continents' worth of colonial territory, but no longer the unchallenged hegemon it had been in the years of Charles V and Philip II. The silver was still coming, the colonies were still producing, the empire's bones were still intact, but the muscles that had made it move, the fiscal flexibility, the military dominance, the institutional confidence were tired in ways that a generation of reform had not managed to address. Bourbon hands on Spanish soil. The man who ended the Habsburg dynasty in Spain was not a revolutionary or a conqueror. He was a king who simply failed to produce an heir, and whose body had been so comprehensively damaged by 2 centuries of dynastic inbreeding that almost nothing about him functioned as it should. Charles II of Spain, known to his contemporaries as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was the final product of a Habsburg family tree that had been folding in on itself for generations. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents on both sides shared the same great-grandparents. The accumulated genetic consequences showed in almost every aspect of his physical existence. He could not chew properly due to the enlarged jaw that was the Habsburg family's most visible trait in its extreme form. He walked late, spoke late, and suffered from a range of ailments that his physicians catalogued with increasing helplessness over the course of his 39 years. At one point, after the royal doctors had run out of medical explanations, it was formally decided that the king was probably bewitched by his enemies, and exorcists were brought in to help. The exorcists did not succeed either, which was presumably a surprise to everyone involved except the king, who had been ill his entire life and had likely stopped expecting solutions. Charles died in 1700 without a surviving child, and the question of who would inherit his empire, Spain, the Americas, the Philippines, remnant territories in Italy, immediately became the central crisis of European politics. He had left a will naming Philip of Anjou, a grandson of the French king, Louis XIV, as his successor. The logic was partly dynastic. Philip had a legitimate claim through the female line and partly strategic. Charles and his advisors hoped that having a French Bourbon on the Spanish throne would bring French protection to the empire, which was no longer capable of defending itself alone. What it actually brought was a continent-wide war. The Grand Alliance of England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and Portugal refused to accept a Bourbon Spain as a French satellite and backed a rival claimant, Archduke Charles of Austria, who also had a legitimate dynastic claim. The War of Spanish Succession lasted from 1701 to 1714 and was fought across Europe, in the Americas, and at sea. Its battles Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet are among the most significant of the early 18th century, and the Duke of Marlborough, who won them, became one of the most celebrated commanders in English history. The outcome, settled at the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, was a compromise. Philip of Anjou became Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, and kept the Spanish mainland and the American colonies, but the price was steep. The Spanish Netherlands went to Austria. Milan, Naples, and Sardinia went to Austria. Sicily went to Savoy. Gibraltar and the island of Minorca went to Britain, along with something that would have long consequences in the Americas, a contract called the Asiento, giving British merchants the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonial markets, a commercial foothold that British traders used to expand their presence throughout the Spanish Empire. The new Bourbon dynasty brought with it French administrative ideas and a French style of centralized government that immediately began reshaping the institutions Spain had built over centuries. The Nueva Planta decrees, issued between 1707 and 1716, abolished the separate legal systems of Aragon, Catalonia, and Valencia, the regional autonomy that had been preserved even under the Habsburgs, and replaced them with a Castilian model of unified administration. Catalonia, which had supported the Austrian claimant during the war and lost, received the new arrangements as punishment. The regional resentments this generated did not go away. They have not gone away yet. The most capable of the Bourbon monarchs was Charles III, who came to the throne in 1759 and brought to Spanish governance a genuine reforming energy that his predecessors had lacked. Charles was a practical man, attentive to detail, interested in improvement, surrounding himself with ministers who shared his commitment to rational administration. His reforms touched almost every area of the empire. The military was reorganized, the tax system was revised, the commercial regulations that had channeled all American trade through Seville were loosened to allow more Spanish ports to participate, and the colonial administration was restructured to increase efficiency and reduce the power of entrenched local elites. The Jesuits were expelled from Spain and all its colonies in 1767, a decision driven partly by political conflict with Rome, partly by colonial administrators' complaints that Jesuit missions functioned as autonomous economic and political entities beyond royal control. In the Americas, the expulsion of roughly 2,500 Jesuits removed the religious order that had been most deeply involved in frontier mission work, particularly in regions like Paraguay, where the Jesuit reductions had created an unusual form of organized indigenous society that was simultaneously admired and resented by colonial authorities. The missions collapsed rapidly after the Jesuits left, and the indigenous populations they had organized scattered. The creation of new viceroyalties, New Granada in 1717, reorganized in 1739, and the Rio de la Plata in 1776, reflected Bourbon efforts to bring more remote parts of the empire under closer administrative control. Buenos Aires, previously a minor port at the edge of the Peruvian viceroyalty, became the capital of a new viceroyalty that included what are now Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. This reorganization was partly about efficiency and partly about defense. The southern Atlantic coast was increasingly contested by British and Portuguese interests, and Spain needed more responsive local governance to protect it. Spain's involvement in the 7 Years' War, which it entered late in 1762 on the French side, resulted in the British capture of both Havana and Manila, the two most important ports of the empire outside the American mainland. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 returned them, but Spain had to cede Florida to Britain in exchange, a loss that stung. It received Louisiana from France as partial compensation, gaining a large and largely ungovernable territory on the North American mainland that it was poorly equipped to develop or defend. The American Revolution, which began in 1775, gave Spain an opportunity it took carefully. The Spanish crown had no particular sympathy for colonial revolutions. The obvious implications for its own empire were not lost on Madrid, but the prospect of weakening Britain was too attractive to pass up. Spain entered the conflict in 1779 as an ally of France, not of the American colonists directly, and fought primarily in the Caribbean and along the Gulf of Mexico, recapturing Florida in the process. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 returned Florida to Spain, a modest territorial gain from a war that had far more significant long-term consequences than Spain yet understood. Those consequences were ideological. The American Revolution had demonstrated that a colonial population could successfully break from its European master and establish a new form of government. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, the year after Charles III died, spread ideas about popular sovereignty, natural rights, and the illegitimacy of inherited monarchy across the Atlantic in pamphlets and newspapers, and the conversations of educated criollos who had been schooled in Enlightenment thought by the very reforms the Bourbons had introduced. The Bourbon reforms had been trying to make the empire more efficient, but in doing so they had also reshuffled colonial resentments. The centralization of power in the hands of Peninsulares Spanish-born officials sent from Madrid to fill positions that Criollo families had come to consider their own grated against a Criollo elite that had been in the Americas for generations, and saw itself as fully capable of self-governance. The reforms that were meant to strengthen the empire's hold on its colonies had instead given the people who would eventually lead the independence movements a very specific list of grievances. The tree had been shaken, the roots were still holding, but the next decade would bring something the roots could not survive. Napoleon kicks the table. The Spanish Empire did not fall to a single dramatic blow. It unravelled through a sequence of events that began in a palace in France and ended, over the following 2 decades, on battlefields across 2 continents. The trigger was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he did not invade Spain to destroy its empire. He did it almost as an afterthought, as part of a larger strategic calculation, and in doing so, he set in motion something he had not planned for and could not control. Spain had been drawn into the orbit of Napoleonic France through the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1796, which committed the 2 countries to a military alliance against Britain. The consequences of that alliance were immediate and serious. Britain, whose navy had been the primary check on French power, turned its attention to the French and Spanish fleets. On October the 21st, 1805, Admiral Horatio Nelson met the combined Franco-Spanish fleet off Cape Trafalgar on the southwestern coast of Spain and destroyed it in an engagement that lasted less than 5 hours. Nelson died in the battle, shot by a French marksman from the rigging of a nearby ship. The French and Spanish lost 22 ships. The British lost none. Spain's capacity to protect its Atlantic trade routes and communicate freely with its American colonies was effectively finished. Nelson had solved the problem of Spanish naval power in an afternoon. The Spanish king who had led his country into this disaster was Charles IV, a man whose indolence was considerable even by the relaxed standards of the late Bourbon monarchy. He had long since delegated effective government to his chief minister, Manuel de Godoy, a guards officer of middling nobility who had risen to his position through the Queen's personal favour and who managed foreign affairs with the confidence of someone who does not fully understand what they are managing. The court of Charles IV had become a quietly dysfunctional place, the king and queen and their minister navigating complex personal loyalties, while the kingdom drifted toward a crisis none of them was equipped to handle. In March of 1808, a riot at the royal palace of Aranjuez forced Charles to dismiss Godoy and then abdicate in favour of his son, who became Ferdinand VII. The sequence of events that followed moved quickly. Napoleon, who had been watching Spanish politics with the calculating patience of someone who had already decided what he was going to do, summoned both Charles and Ferdinand to Bayonne in southwestern France under the pretext of mediating their dispute. What happened at Bayonne was not mediation. Napoleon pressured Ferdinand to return the crown to his father, who then surrendered it to Napoleon, who gave it to his brother Joseph. Joseph Bonaparte became King of Spain in May of 1808. The Spanish people received this arrangement with an absence of enthusiasm that expressed itself immediately in violence. On May the 2nd, 1808, the Dos de Mayo, the population of Madrid, rose against the French garrison in an uprising that was suppressed with extreme brutality. The executions carried out by French soldiers on the morning of May the 3rd became the subject of 2 paintings by Francisco de Goya that remain among the most powerful images of political violence ever made. The uprising in Madrid was the beginning of what the Spanish call the War of Independence, and what the rest of the world usually calls the Peninsular War, a conflict that lasted until 1814 and was fought with a ferocity that shocked even veterans of Napoleon's previous campaigns. The Spanish resistance organized itself through juntas, local governing bodies that sprang up in cities and provinces across the country to fill the vacuum left by the collapse of the central monarchy. The juntas fought, quarrelled with each other, and gradually coalesced into a national resistance movement centered on the port city of Cadiz, where a Cortes, a parliament assembled, and in 1812 produced the Constitution of La Pepa, one of the most liberal constitutional documents of its era. The guerrilla warfare that characterized much of the peninsular conflict gave English the word guerrilla, Spanish for little war, and demonstrated that a population willing to fight in dispersed, irregular fashion could tie down a large conventional army almost indefinitely. British and Portuguese forces under the Duke of Wellington fought alongside the Spanish regulars, and together they ground down the French occupation over years of brutal campaigning. But the war in Spain had already produced a consequence that would prove impossible to undo. The question it posed to Spain's American colonies was simple and unanswerable within the existing political framework. If the legitimate king was a captive and a French usurper sat on the throne, what did the colonies owe to Madrid? To whom did loyalty properly belong? The colonies' answer, which arrived in a series of local crises throughout 1810, was to themselves. In Caracas, on April the 19th, 1810, a local junta deposed the Spanish captain general and began governing Venezuela in the name of the captive Ferdinand. In Buenos Aires, on May the 25th, 1810, a similar junta took control of the Rio de la Plata, an event celebrated in Argentina as the May Revolution. In Bogotá, on July the 20th, 1810, the Grito de Independencia marked the beginning of Colombian self-governance. In Chile, on September the 18th, 1810, a national junta formed in Santiago. In Mexico, the break came from an unexpected direction. On September the 16th, 1810, a parish priest in the small town of Dolores named Miguel Hidalgo rang his church bell and addressed his congregation in a speech, the Grito de Dolores, the cry of Dolores calling them to rise against bad government. Hidalgo was not a Criollo elite figure pursuing a measured political agenda. He was a priest with genuine connections to the indigenous and mestizo poor of central Mexico, and the movement that followed his speech was as much a social uprising as a political one, a vast and violent march of agricultural workers, indigenous communities, and mestizo labourers that terrified the Criollo establishment as much as it frightened the Spanish. Hidalgo was eventually captured, defrocked, and shot in 1811, but the movement he had started did not stop. Ferdinand VII was restored to the Spanish throne in 1814, after Napoleon's defeat and exile. He responded to his restoration by abolishing the Constitution of 1812, arresting the liberal reformers who had written it, and attempting to reimpose the absolute monarchy that the juntas had been fighting to limit. His response to the American independence movements was equally uncompromising: military reconquest. The armies he sent produced real results in some regions. Venezuela was briefly reconquered, and a brutal campaign of repression drove Simón Bolívar into temporary exile. But the resources available were limited, the distance is enormous, and the political will among Criollo populations to accept royal authority increasingly absent. In 1820, a military revolt in Spain, under General Rafael del Riego, forced Ferdinand to restore the constitution, plunging Spain into 3 years of internal political conflict that entirely consumed its attention and left the American campaigns without reinforcement. The timing was decisive. Bolívar's forces won the Battle of Boyacá in 1819, securing Colombia. San Martín crossed the Andes and liberated Chile in 1818. The Army of the Andes then moved north into Peru. Mexico achieved independence in 1821, when the royalist commander, Agustín de Iturbide, switched sides and marched into Mexico City. Central America followed shortly after. By 1825, when Antonio José de Sucre's victory at the Battle of Ayacucho ended the last significant Spanish military presence in South America, the empire that had taken a century and a half to build had dissolved in 15 years. What remained was Spain itself, the peninsula, a a few Caribbean islands, the Philippines, and a handful of smaller territories. The largest empire the Western world had known had become, with remarkable speed, a medium-sized European country with colonial remnants. The collapse was not simply military. It was a failure of political imagination, an inability to offer the Criollo elites of the Americas a constitutional framework that might have kept them within a reformed empire. Ferdinand's reactionary stubbornness had made compromise impossible at exactly the moment when compromise might still have mattered. What the empire left behind. In 1898, 323 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, Spain fought its last imperial war and lost it in 4 months. The conflict with the United States, which the Spanish call El Desastre, the disaster, began over Cuba, which had been a Spanish colony since the 1500s and had been fighting for independence in fits and starts since the 1860s. American newspapers, the Cuban independence movement, and a naval explosion of disputed origin combined to push the United States into war with Spain in April of 1898. The fighting was brief and thoroughly one-sided. At the Battle of Manila Bay in the Philippines, the American Asiatic Squadron destroyed the Spanish fleet in under 7 hours without losing a single ship. In Cuba, American and Cuban forces together drove the Spanish from their last military positions in a campaign of weeks. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December of 1898, formalized the end. Spain surrendered Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. It sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The transaction had a finality about it that struck contemporaries as almost shocking in its comprehensiveness. In a single document, Spain gave up everything that remained of the empire Columbus had set in motion 406 years earlier, and received $20 million and the right to exist as a medium-sized European country. The generation of Spanish writers and thinkers who came of age in the aftermath, the generation of 98, as they are known, spent their careers examining what had happened to their country and why. Miguel de Unamuno, Antonio Machado, José Ortega y Gasset, men who took the disaster as the starting point for a profound national reckoning with Spanish identity, its values, its history, its failures. The empire's end produced in Spain something that the empire's height had not, a culture of serious self-examination. But the empire's end in 1898 was the end of something that had already substantially ended in the 1820s. What Spain lost in 1898 were remnants, important ones, but remnants nonetheless. The main event was the wave of independence movements that swept the American colonies between 1810 and 1825. What those movements left behind was not an absence, but something far more complicated. A set of new nations built on colonial foundations, inheriting colonial languages, colonial religions, colonial legal systems, and colonial social hierarchies, and then struggling to build something genuinely new on top of them. The most visible legacy of the Spanish Empire is linguistic. Spanish is spoken today by approximately 500 million people as a first language, making it the second most widely spoken native language in the world. It is the official or dominant language of 20 countries, all of them former Spanish colonies except Spain itself. This is not simply a fact about communication. Language carries history inside it, the words that exist in Spanish for concepts that arrived through the conquest, the words borrowed from Nahuatl and Quechua and Taino that document the encounter between worlds, the regional varieties that developed across centuries of separation and local influence. When a Mexican speaks Spanish, they are using a language shaped simultaneously by Castilian grammar, indigenous vocabulary, and 400 years of American history. The linguistic map of the Americas is one of the most enduring things the Spanish Empire made. The Catholic Church is the other institution that survived the empire's political collapse with its influence largely intact. Latin America remains predominantly Catholic, though the nature of that Catholicism was shaped from the beginning by the encounter between Spanish religious practice and indigenous spiritual traditions that persisted beneath. alongside, and sometimes inside the Christian framework. The Virgin of Guadalupe, the apparition reported by an indigenous man named Juan Diego near Mexico City in 1531, became the most important religious symbol in Mexican Catholicism, combining indigenous imagery with Christian theology in a synthesis that neither the indigenous tradition nor the Spanish Church had planned for. Across the continent, similar syntheses occurred, producing regional expressions of Catholicism that carry the marks of their specific historical origins. The legal and political legacy is more troubled. The administrative systems Spain built, centralized, hierarchical, oriented toward extraction rather than development, left patterns in governance that the new republics of the 19th century struggled to overcome. The hacienda system that replaced the encomienda concentrated agricultural land in the hands of a small elite, a pattern of land ownership that persisted through independence and shaped the economic inequality of Latin American societies for generations. The racial hierarchy of the colonial caste system did not disappear. With independence, the Criollo elites, who led most of the independence movements, replaced Spanish peninsulares at the top of the social structure but maintained the structures of inequality below them largely intact. The demographic catastrophe of the conquest and colonization was one of the largest in human history. Conservative estimates suggest that the indigenous population of the Americas fell by 50 to 90% in the century and a half following European contact, from a pre-contact figure that scholars estimate at somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. Disease drove most of that collapse, but the systems of forced labor and dispossession that accompanied colonization ensured that populations already devastated by epidemic had no stable ground to recover on. The indigenous peoples who survived, and tens of millions of their descendants live today across the Americas, did so through a combination of biological luck, cultural adaptability, and sheer persistence that the historical record tends to undercount. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, and pathogens between the old and new worlds that the Spanish Empire set in motion, is perhaps the most consequential biological event in human history since the last ice age. From the Americas came tomatoes, potatoes, maize, cacao, chili peppers, tobacco, vanilla, rubber, and squash foods and materials that transformed European cuisine, European agriculture, and European economies in ways that took generations to fully register. The potato alone is credited with sustaining population growth across northern Europe through the 18th and 19th centuries, feeding Irish peasants and Russian serfs on calories that European agriculture could not otherwise have produced at that density. From Europe came wheat, cattle, horses, pigs, chickens, and the diseases that killed with such terrible efficiency. The horses deserve a particular mention because their effect on the cultures of the American plains and prairies, the Comanche, the Lakota, the Crow, the Apache, was transformative in ways that operated largely outside the Spanish colonial system. Horses introduced by the Spanish spread northward through indigenous trade networks, and within a century had created entirely new ways of life across a vast region that Spain itself never effectively controlled. The Great Plains Indian cultures of the 18th and 19th centuries, the cultures that feature prominently in American mythology, were products of the Spanish Empire's most accidental export. The question of how to assess the Spanish Empire overall has generated arguments that have not finished and perhaps cannot finish, because the empire produced genuinely contradictory things simultaneously. It destroyed civilizations and built universities. It extracted enormous wealth through coerced labor and created a legal tradition that recognized the humanity of the people being coerced. It spread a language that became the vehicle for some of the most significant literature of the modern era. Cervantes, Sor Juana, Pablo Neruda, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and it suppressed, deliberately and systematically, the languages and cultural traditions of the peoples whose lands it occupied. The Black Legend, the Protestant-era narrative that reduced the Spanish Empire to a story of uniquely Spanish cruelty, was propaganda and it served political purposes that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. The Spanish were not uniquely cruel. The violence of their conquest was proportionate to the stakes, which were enormous, and to the culture of the era, which sanctioned violence in service of expansion and religious conformity. The English, Dutch, French, and Portuguese empires that followed were not gentle alternatives. What distinguished the Spanish was priority. They arrived first, on the largest scale, and the template they established shaped everything that came after. What the Spanish Empire ultimately was, stripped of both its defenders' romanticization and its critics' reduction, was a human project driven by human motivations, organized by human institutions, and productive of human consequences across an extraordinary scale of time and geography. It was built by people trying to get rich, trying to save souls, trying to serve their king, trying to survive, and occasionally trying to understand what they were seeing. That it changed the world is not in question. The world it made is the one we still live in. And so the story of the Spanish Empire comes quietly to rest. A kingdom forged from centuries of conflict, carried across oceans on the ambitions of a few hundred sailors and soldiers, stretched until it touched almost every shore, and then, slowly, inevitably, returned to something smaller and more human. The silver mountains are still there. The cathedrals are still standing. The languages, the food, the music, all of it remains. History does not disappear. It just becomes the ground beneath our feet. If you are still awake, there is another video waiting for you on screen, ready to carry you a little further into the past. And if this one stayed with you, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought in the comments below. It genuinely means something. For now, though, let your shoulders drop. Let the story settle. Close your eyes. The Empire has sailed its last voyage for tonight. Good night. Sleep well,